Every morning before the shop opened, Samuel Carter left a bag of food and a hot coffee by the front door for a woman who stood quietly at the corner. She never asked for anything. She never spoke. Her eyes carried the kind of exhaustion that comes from being invisible for too long. Samuel never questioned it. He just showed up every single day the way decent people do when no one is watching. Then, one rainy morning, the door swung open. A man in a tailored suit walked in, flanked by 4 bodyguards in black. He looked straight at the counter and asked, "Who is Samuel Carter?" But that moment didn't come out of nowhere. It started weeks earlier in the kind of quiet that nobody notices until it's already become something bigger. Samuel Carter was 32 years old and had been working the morning shift at Langford's Coffee for almost 3 years. The shop sat on a narrow street in South Boston, squeezed between a laundromat and a closed-down barbershop. It wasn't the kind of place that attracted tourists or reviewers. It survived on regulars, construction workers, before dawn, nurses after night shifts, a few retirees who came more for the routine than the coffee. Mr. Langford, the owner, was a man in his 60s who ran the place like it was still 1985. He didn't believe in renovations, loyalty bonuses, or second chances. Samuel didn't complain. He couldn't afford to. Every dollar from that register went toward rent, groceries, and keeping the lights on in a 1-bedroom apartment he shared with his 5-year-old son, Eli. There was no wife, no family safety net, no backup plan. Just the alarm at 4:15 every morning, the bus ride in the dark, and the smell of ground coffee before the sun came up. He owed 3 months on a medical bill from when Eli had pneumonia the previous winter, and the collection agency had started calling twice a week. But Samuel kept showing up. That was the one thing he knew how to do. Show up, keep his head down, and not make noise. The first time he noticed her, it was a Tuesday in early October. She was standing near the corner of the building, close enough to the entrance to be visible, but far enough not to block anyone's path. Her coat was faded olive green, too thin for the season. Her shoes had been white once, maybe a long time ago. She didn't hold a sign. She didn't extend a hand. She just stood there, arms folded across her chest, watching the sidewalk, as if waiting for something that was never going to arrive. Her name, though Samuel wouldn't learn it for a while, was Grace Whitmore. And there was something about the way she carried herself, shoulders straight, even when the wind hit hard, that told him she wasn't used to standing on the wrong side of a door. The next morning, Samuel came in early. He pulled a fresh sesame bagel from the tray before it went on display, wrapped it in a paper napkin, and poured a small coffee with 2 sugars. He placed both inside a brown bag and set it near the side entrance next to the trash bin where she usually stood. He didn't say anything. He didn't make eye contact. He just left it and went back inside like he'd been taking out garbage. It was easier that way for both of them. Grace took the bag. She didn't say thank you. She didn't look through the window. She just picked it up after he walked away and moved to a bench across the street. The next day, Samuel did it again. Same bag, same spot. This time he put in a muffin instead of a bagel and slipped a discount coupon from the register inside. It was the kind of coupon they gave to loyalty customers worth $2 off any order. He covered the difference from his own tips. Nobody asked where it went. Nobody was paying that much attention except Derek. Derek was the other morning shift worker, a 26-year-old who talked too much and cleaned too little. He spotted the routine within the first week. One morning while Samuel was wiping down the counter, Derek leaned over and said, "You know, she's out there again. Right, that woman. Every single day." Samuel didn't look up. Derek kept going. "I'm just saying, man. You start feeding strays, they don't leave. Langford's gonna notice eventually." Samuel set the rag down and said, "She's not a stray." Derek raised both hands and backed off, but his expression made it clear he wasn't done thinking about it. By the second week, Grace had begun to nod. Not a full acknowledgement, just a small dip of the head, when Samuel placed the bag near the side door. Once on a particularly cold morning, she looked directly at him through the glass. Her eyes were tired, but focused, the kind of look that carried more weight than most people's words. Samuel nodded back. That was all. No conversation, no names, no story. Just two people on opposite sides of a window, both trying to get through the morning. He didn't know why it mattered to him. Maybe it was because he knew what it felt like to be one bad month away from standing on that same corner. Maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe he just didn't want to be the kind of man who looked away. By the third week, Derek had mentioned it to Mr. Langford, not as a formal complaint, just a passing comment while restocking napkins. Sam's been leaving food out for that homeless woman again. Langford didn't say much at first, but the following day he pulled Samuel aside before the shift started. I'm not running a shelter, Carter. I've got a business. You want to be generous. Do it on your own time and with your own food. Samuel nodded and said nothing. That afternoon he bought a box of granola bars from the corner store with his own money. The next morning the brown bag was there again, same spot, same time. He just stopped using anything from the shop. Then one morning, Grace wasn't there. Samuel set the bag down at the usual spot and waited. He checked the corner. He looked across the street. The bench was empty. The sidewalk was clean. No olive coat. No worn shoes. No quiet figure folding her arms against the wind. He told himself it didn't mean anything. People move. People disappear. That's what cities do. They swallow people whole and never give them back. But something sat wrong in his chest all day, a low hum of worry he couldn't name or shake. The next morning, she still wasn't there. Samuel made the coffee anyway, and left it by the door just in case. It sat untouched until noon when he threw it out. Derek noticed the bag still sitting there and smirked, but said nothing. Langford didn't seem to care either way. The only person who noticed Grace's absence as something that actually mattered was the one person who had no way to find her. On the third day, just past 7:30 in the morning, the front door of Langford's Coffee opened with enough force to make the bell above it slam against the glass. A man walked in, mid-50s, steel gray hair charcoal suit that probably cost more than Samuel made in 2 months. Behind him stood 4 men in matching black jackets, hands folded in front of them, faces blank. The customers nearest the door went silent. Derek stopped mid-pour. Even Langford, who had been arguing with a supplier on the phone, slowly hung up. The man in the suit didn't look at the menu. He didn't glance at the pastry case. He walked directly to the counter, placed one hand flat on the surface and said, "I'm looking for Samuel Carter." Samuel was standing 3 feet away holding a damp rag and a half-empty bus tray. Every pair of eyes in the shop turned to him. He set the tray down slowly, straightened his apron, and said, "That's me." The man studied him for a moment, not with hostility, but with the precise measuring gaze of someone accustomed to reading people in seconds. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a business card. "My name is Philip Hargrove. I'm an attorney. We need to talk about Grace Whitmore." Samuel felt the floor shift slightly beneath him, though nothing had moved. He didn't recognize the last name, but the first name that landed somewhere deep and immediate. He looked at the 4 men behind Hargrove, then back at the card. "I don't understand," he said. Philip Hargrove tucked the card into Samuel's apron pocket and said, "You will." Langford's office was barely a room, more like a storage closet, with a desk shoved inside stacked with invoices and napkin orders. Philip Hargrove stood in the center of it, like a man who had walked into 100 rooms that weren't built for him and never once adjusted his posture. 2 of the bodyguards waited outside the door. The other 2 stayed in the shop, standing near the entrance, like statues that breathed. Samuel closed the door behind him and leaned against the wall, because there was nowhere else to stand. Through the thin walls, he could hear Derek whispering to a customer, and the words weren't quiet enough. Lawyer, bodyguards. Probably in some kind of trouble. Philip didn't waste time. He opened a leather folder and placed a photograph on the desk. It showed a woman in a navy dress standing beside an older man at what looked like a fundraiser. The woman's hair was pulled back, Her posture composed, her expression careful. Samuel recognized the eyes before anything else. The same tired, steady gaze he'd seen through the window of the shop every morning for 3 weeks. "That's her," Samuel said. Philip nodded. "Grace Whitmore. The man beside her is her late father, Richard Whitmore. He passed away 11 months ago." Samuel didn't know the name, but the way Philip said it, slow, deliberate, weighted, made it clear that other people did. Philip explained that the Whitmore family had built a logistics and real estate empire across the Northeast over 3 decades. Richard Whitmore had left behind a will, and that will had split the family in half. Samuel listened, but the more Philip talked, the less he understood why any of this involved him. He finally said, "I gave her coffee and a bagel. That's it. I don't know anything about her family." Philip closed the folder and looked at him directly. "Mr. Carter, in the last 11 months, Grace has been followed, threatened, and forced out of every place she tried to stay. You are the only person in that time who helped her without knowing who she was. That matters more than you think." When Samuel came back out to the counter, the shop had gone quiet in the wrong way. Langford was standing by the register, arms crossed, watching him like a man calculating how much trouble one employee was worth. Derek avoided eye contact entirely. A few customers glanced at Samuel sideways. Nobody asked what happened. Nobody needed to. The bodyguards filed out behind Philip, and the black sedan idled at the curb for a full minute before pulling away. Langford waited until the car was gone, then said 2 words to Samuel. "Clock in." No questions. No sympathy. Just a reminder of where Samuel stood in the order of things. That evening, after picking Eli up from the neighbor who watched him during shifts, Samuel sat at the kitchen table and stared at Philip Hargrove's business card. Eli was on the floor, drawing with crayons, humming some song he'd learned at daycare. The apartment was small enough that Samuel could see every corner from where he sat: the leaking faucet, the stacked bills on the counter, the winter coat Eli had already outgrown. Everything in this room reminded him of how thin the line was between where he stood and where Grace had been standing. He turned the card over. On the back, Philip had written a phone number and a single sentence: "She wants to speak with you." Samuel put the card in the kitchen drawer and closed it. He didn't call that night. He wasn't sure what he was afraid of, maybe that whatever Grace needed from him was bigger than anything he could carry. He had enough weight already. But lying in bed that night, listening to Eli breathe in the next room, he kept thinking about the brown bag sitting untouched by the side door, the empty corner, the olive coat that wasn't there anymore. And he realized the thing that scared him most wasn't getting involved. It was knowing that someone might need him and choosing to look away. He called the next morning before his shift. Philip picked up on the second ring as if he'd been waiting. He gave Samuel an address, a residential hotel on the other side of the city, 4th floor, room 412. Samuel went after work, still in his apron, smelling like espresso and dishwater. A bodyguard met him in the lobby and walked him upstairs without a word. The door to 412 was already open. Grace was sitting by the window. Her clothes were different now, clean-fitted, a dark sweater and slacks. Her hair was washed and pulled back, but her face carried the same exhaustion Samuel had seen every morning outside the shop, the kind that no amount of clean clothes could cover. She looked up when he entered and said, "Sit down, Samuel." It was the first time he'd heard her voice. It was low, steady, and cracked at the edges, like something that had been held together too long. He sat across from her at a small table, and she told him everything. Her father had left 60% of the estate to her and 40% to her older brother, Victor Whitmore. But the will also included a clause Grace would serve as the sole trustee of the family's charitable foundation, which controlled tens of millions in assets. Victor had contested the will the day after the funeral. He claimed their father had been mentally unfit, that Grace had manipulated him, that the foundation was a front for her to control the money. The courts hadn't ruled yet, but Victor wasn't waiting for a verdict. He had hired private investigators to track Grace's movements. He had pressured her landlord into breaking her lease. He had frozen her access to shared accounts. Grace had spent the last 4 months moving between shelters, motels, and park benches, trying to stay invisible until her legal team could secure a court date. Samuel sat there, turning his hands over on the table, trying to fit all of this into the version of Grace he'd known, the quiet woman who stood outside a coffee shop and accepted a bagel without a word. "Why me?" he asked. Grace looked at him, the way she had through the glass that one cold morning, and said, "Because you didn't want anything. Everyone else who helped me because they found out who I was. You helped me before you knew. That's the only kind of person I can trust right now." She told him that Philip was preparing a formal declaration for the court, and she needed a character witness, someone unconnected to her family, someone with no financial motive, someone who could testify that Grace Whitmore had lived on the street and been treated with basic dignity by a stranger. She wasn't asking him to fight her battle. She was asking him to tell the truth. Samuel agreed, though the word yes felt heavier than he expected. Within days, the weight of that decision began pressing into every part of his life. It started with a phone call. He was at home heating up soup for Eli when his phone rang from a blocked number. A man's voice, calm and professional, said, "Mr. Carter, you're about to involve yourself in a family matter that doesn't concern you. I'd encourage you to reconsider." The line went dead before Samuel could respond. 2 days later, someone filed a complaint against Langford's Coffee with the city health department. The inspector arrived during the morning rush clipboard, in hand, checking temperatures and expiration labels with the kind of precision that only comes when someone is looking for a reason to shut things down. Langford blamed Samuel without saying his name, just stood behind the counter muttering about people who bring problems through the door. Derek, who had once called Grace a stray, now avoided Samuel entirely, as though proximity to him was a professional risk. Then the rumors started. A regular customer mentioned to Langford that she'd heard Samuel was involved in a lawsuit, something about a rich family downtown. Another said she'd seen the black sedan parked outside the shop twice that week. The facts didn't matter. The story people told themselves was simpler. Samuel was either a con man, a fool, or both. Nobody considered the possibility that he was just a man who'd left a bag of food by a door and accidentally stepped into something he couldn't step out of. Samuel met Grace once more during this stretch, briefly in the lobby of the residential hotel. She looked better physically, but her voice was thinner, like the pressure from the other side was tightening around her too. She told him that Victor's people had contacted 2 other potential witnesses before Samuel, and both had backed out within a week. "They'll try to make you quit," she said. "They'll go after your job, your landlord, anything that makes your life harder." Samuel looked at her and said, "My life's already hard. That part isn't new." Grace didn't smile, but something shifted behind her eyes, a flicker of recognition, maybe even relief, from someone who had almost forgotten what it looked like when a person meant what they said. The breaking point came on a Thursday. Samuel arrived at work to find the front door locked and a notice taped to the glass. The city had ordered a temporary closure of Langford's Coffee, pending a full inspection, plumbing, electrical, fire safety, the works. Langford was already inside, standing behind the counter in the dark, staring at the notice like it had personally betrayed him. When Samuel walked in through the back, Langford turned and said, "This is because of you." Samuel tried to explain, but Langford cut him off. "I don't care who she is. I don't care what you signed or what you promised. This shop is all I've got. And if it goes down because you wanted to play hero, that's on you." Samuel clocked out that morning with no shift to work, and no guarantee the shop would reopen by Monday. He took the bus home in silence, sat on the edge of his bed, and did the math. Rent was due in 9 days. The medical bills were still unpaid. He had $87 in his checking account, and a 5-year-old who needed to eat 3 times a day. Everything he'd tried to hold together, the job, the dignity, the small, stubborn belief that doing the right thing wouldn't destroy him, was cracking down the middle. That night, Eli crawled into his lap while he was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. "Daddy, are you sad?" the boy asked. Samuel held his son against his chest and said, "No, buddy, just thinking." But the truth was uglier than that. He was thinking about calling Philip Hargrove and saying he was out. He was thinking about erasing the number, forgetting the name Grace Whitmore, and going back to a life where the hardest decision he made each morning was whether to leave a bagel or a muffin by the side door. He was thinking that maybe Derek had been right all along, that kindness in this city was just another way to lose. He didn't sleep that night. He lay in the dark, listening to Eli's breathing through the wall, and ran through every version of the future he could see. In every one, something was lost. The job, the court case, the woman who had stood outside his shop and trusted him without a word. He couldn't save all of it. He probably couldn't save most of it. But when the sun came up and the room turned gray with early light, Samuel got dressed, packed Eli's lunch, and picked up the phone. He didn't call Philip Hargrove to quit. He called to ask what he needed to do next. The hearing took place on a Tuesday morning in a downtown Boston courtroom. Samuel had never been inside one before. The ceilings were higher than any room he'd ever worked in, and the air smelled like old wood and paper. Philip Hargrove had arranged for a neighbor to watch Eli and sent a car to pick Samuel up at 6:30 in the morning. Samuel wore the only button-down shirt he owned, white, slightly wrinkled, tucked into dark pants he usually saved for parent-teacher meetings. He looked like exactly what he was, a working man sitting in a room built for people with more money and more power than he would ever have. Grace sat near the front, dressed in a navy blazer and white blouse, her posture straight and still. Philip was beside her, flipping through a thick folder with the kind of calm that suggested he had done this 100 times before. On the opposite side of the room sat Victor Whitmore. Samuel had never seen him in person, but he didn't need an introduction. Victor was tall, mid-40s, with the same jaw as Grace, but none of the warmth. His legal team occupied an entire row. 3 attorneys, 2 assistants, and a man who looked like a private investigator pretending to be a paralegal. Victor didn't look at Grace. He didn't look at anyone. He sat with his arms crossed, staring straight ahead, as though the outcome had already been decided in a room Samuel would never be invited into. The first hour was procedural motions, objections, references to documents Samuel didn't understand. Then Victor's lead attorney, a sharp-voiced woman named Catherine Hale, stood and directed attention to Samuel. She didn't address him gently. She turned to the judge and said that the opposing party had brought in an outside witness with no verifiable connection to the Whitmore family, no professional standing, and no legal qualification to speak on matters of character. She said the word character, the way someone might say performance. Then she looked directly at Samuel and asked him to explain in his own words the nature of his relationship with Grace Whitmore. Samuel gripped the edge of his seat. Philip had prepared him for this, had told him to stay calm to speak, simply to not let anyone twist his words. But Catherine Hale wasn't done. She pulled a sheet of paper from her file and read from it a timeline of every interaction between Samuel and Grace, compiled from surveillance footage and witness interviews. She pointed out that Samuel had provided food and drink to Grace on at least 14 separate occasions over 3 weeks. She noted that Samuel was in significant personal debt. She suggested that Grace, knowing she would need a sympathetic witness, had deliberately positioned herself outside his place of work. "This isn't kindness," Catherine said, turning to face the room. "This is a transaction. Mr. Carter helped because he was told there would be a reward, and Ms. Whitmore recruited him because she needed someone who looked the part." The room shifted. A few people in the gallery whispered. Victor's expression didn't change, but one corner of his mouth tightened just enough to suggest satisfaction. Samuel felt heat rise along the back of his neck. He looked at Grace. Her face was still, but her hands, folded on the table in front of her, had gone white at the knuckles. Philip Hargrove stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't object. He simply asked the judge for permission to let Samuel respond. The judge nodded. Philip turned to Samuel and said, "Mr. Carter, tell the court what you knew about Grace Whitmore when you first offered her food." Samuel leaned forward slightly and said, "Nothing." Philip asked, "Did you know her name?" Samuel said, "No." Philip asked, "Did you know she was connected to any estate, any fortune, any legal dispute?" Samuel shook his head and said, "I didn't know any of that. I didn't even know her last name until your business card ended up in my apron pocket." Philip let the silence hold for a moment, then asked one more question. "Then why did you help her?" Samuel looked at the judge, then at the room full of strangers who had already formed their opinions, and said, "Because she was standing outside in the cold and nobody else was doing anything. That's it. I didn't run a background check. I didn't ask for her story. I just thought if my son were ever that alone, I'd want someone to hand him a cup of coffee and not make it weird." His voice didn't shake. It didn't rise. It came out flat, honest, and tired, like a man who had used up all his adrenaline weeks ago and only had the truth left. Catherine Hale tried to follow up, but Philip was already moving. He submitted 3 pieces of evidence to the court. The first was a set of financial records showing that Victor Whitmore had hired a private security firm not to protect Grace, but to monitor her movements and pressure anyone who offered her assistance. The second was a recorded phone call between Victor's assistant and the city inspector who had ordered the closure of Langford's Coffee, a call in which the assistant specifically named Samuel Carter and asked for maximum disruption. The third was a signed affidavit from the 2 previous witnesses who had withdrawn their testimony, both stating they had received direct threats from representatives of Victor's legal team. The courtroom didn't erupt. It went cold. Catherine Hale asked for a recess. The judge denied it. Victor Whitmore uncrossed his arms for the first time and leaned toward his attorneys, whispering something none of them seemed prepared to answer. Philip Hargrove didn't celebrate. He closed his folder and sat down beside Grace, who hadn't moved since the hearing began. The judge reviewed the evidence, asked 3 follow-up questions of Philip, and ordered a formal investigation into Victor Whitmore's legal team for witness intimidation and abuse of municipal process. After the hearing, Grace walked out of the courtroom ahead of everyone else. Samuel found her standing in the hallway near a window, looking out at the street below. She didn't turn around when he approached, but she said, "I spent 11 months thinking I'd lost everything. My name, my home, my ability to trust anyone. And the thing that brought me back wasn't a lawyer or a court order. It was a bag of food by a side door, left by someone who didn't even want credit for it." Samuel stood beside her and said nothing, because nothing he could say would be bigger than what she'd just carried out of that room. 2 weeks later, Grace Whitmore made a public announcement. She used her portion of the estate to establish a foundation in her father's name, focused on supporting low-wage workers and people experiencing homelessness, direct aid legal protection, and job placement. One of the foundation's first programs was a partnership with small businesses across Boston to offer free morning meals, fully funded and legally structured, so that no shop owner would bear the cost alone. Langford's Coffee was the first to sign on. The city dropped its inspection order. Langford never thanked Samuel directly, but he gave him a raise and stopped mentioning the side door. Samuel Carter didn't become rich. He didn't move into a bigger apartment or quit his job at the coffee shop. He still woke up at 4:15, still rode the bus in the dark, still packed Eli's lunch before the sun came up. But the medical bills were paid not by Grace directly, but through the foundation's emergency assistance program, which Samuel qualified for like anyone else. He applied, submitted the paperwork, and received a letter in the mail 6 weeks later. No special treatment. No favors. Just a system that worked the way systems are supposed to work when the right people are in charge of building them. Grace didn't stay in Boston. She moved back to her father's home in Connecticut once the legal battle was resolved, but she returned to the city every few months to oversee the foundation's operations. She and Samuel spoke occasionally brief conversations, never long, never about anything dramatic. Once she asked how Eli was doing, and Samuel told her the boy had started reading on his own. Grace smiled at that. A real one, small and unguarded, the kind of expression she probably hadn't worn in over a year. On a morning in early spring, Samuel arrived at the shop before anyone else. He unlocked the front door, turned on the lights, and started the first pot of coffee. Through the window, he noticed a man standing near the corner, where Grace used to wait, older, unshaven hands, deep in his coat pockets, staring at the sidewalk. Samuel didn't think about it for long. He pulled a fresh bagel from the tray, poured a small coffee with 2 sugars, and placed them both in a brown paper bag. He walked to the side door, set the bag down on the step, and went back inside. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Some things don't require an explanation. They just require someone willing to do them quietly, consistently, without asking what they'll get in return. Because that's the truth. No one talks about kindness. Doesn't need an audience. It doesn't need a receipt. It's not a debt someone owes you, and it's not a sacrifice that should leave you broken. It's a choice made in the smallest moments, when no one is watching and nothing is guaranteed. And sometimes, just sometimes, that choice reaches further than any courtroom, any fortune, or any name on a building ever could. Not because it changes the world, but because it reminds one person, just one, that they haven't been forgotten.